For DTC B1175, the vehicle may have a fuel level sensor circuit malfunction that the gauge control module is seeing. In plain terms, the vehicle may not be getting a believable fuel level signal, so the fuel gauge can act wrong and the low fuel indicator may blink. The possible fault area may be the fuel gauge sending unit, the wiring between the sender and the gauge control module, a connection problem, or the gauge control module itself. If other codes are present, check what they mean first so you do not chase a symptom from another body electrical issue. Start by checking the fuel gauge behavior. The first decision is simple. Does the gauge move to empty and does the low fuel indicator blink? If it does, keep going with the circuit test. If it does not, treat it as an intermittent failure for now. At that point, the system is okay at this time, and the next thing to look for is a loose or poor connection. Next, check whether the gauge can respond to a known input. Turn the vehicle to OFF, or lock mode, and disconnect the fuel gauge sending unit 4P connector. Connect terminal A to terminal B using a 2 ohms resistor and a jumper wire. Terminal A is cavity no. 2 at the fuel gauge sending unit 4P connector, and terminal B is body ground. Then remove the no. A2910 a fuse from the underhood fuse and relay box for at least 10 seconds. Reinstall it, turn the vehicle to on mode, and check the fuel gauge. If the gauge moves to full, the gauge responded to the simulated sender input, so move on to checking the fuel gauge side. If the gauge does not move to full, go after the fuel gauge plus side next. With the vehicle in on mode and the fuel gauge sending unit 4P connector still disconnected, measure voltage between gauge control module connector A, 32P, cavity no, 22 and body ground. You are checking whether battery voltage is present. If battery voltage is present, repair an open or high resistance in the wire. If battery voltage is not present, the fuel gauge plus wire is okay. And the next directed action is to replace the gauge control module. If the gauge did move to full during the simulated sender test, switch to the fuel gauge side. Turn the vehicle to OFF, or lock mode, and disconnect gauge control module connector A, 32P. With the fuel gauge sending unit 4P connector disconnected and gauge control module connector A disconnected, check continuity between gauge control module connector A, 32P, cavity no, 21, and fuel gauge sending unit 4P connector cavity no, 4. If there is continuity, the fuel gauge wire is okay, and the next directed action is to replace the fuel gauge sending unit. If there is no continuity, repair an open or high resistance in that wire. The clean path for B1175 is to confirm the gauge symptom, simulate the sender, then isolate whether the problem is on the fuel gauge plus side, the fuel gauge side, the sending unit, or the gauge control module. Follow the test results in order and avoid jumping to parts. For more diagnostic training, visit stepdiagnostics.com.